very warm welcome to today's program. I'd like to introduce our resident musician, and I hope I pronounce his name right. It's Diego Laverde, and he's going to be playing the Yanera harp for us. Thank you so much. I forgot to mention this is a Latin American harp, but I think you could probably tell from the tempo. Diego's going to join us a little bit later to play for us again, but thank you so much for that. So a very warm welcome today for our program, Making Space for Spirituality in Healthcare. And it's great that so many of you have made space in your timetable for this. Can I just get a little idea? Who's here coming into contact with the Jankey Foundation for the first time that maybe doesn't know much about us? Yeah? Don't be shy. Great. There's a huge amount of information outside and outside the conference area where we're going to have the workshop. So please do help yourself to that. But I'll just give you a brief history. The foundation's been up and running for nearly 11 years now, and it originated essentially to support a very interesting hospital in India, Global Hospital and Research Centre. And that's a very interesting hospital in the sense it's looking to incorporate mainstream medicine with alternative techniques and also spirituality. So the foundation was initially set up to support that, and outside of India, because the charity is based in the UK, I think our main work is really supporting health practitioners through essentially education programs and looking particularly at the area of how health is connected to spirituality. If you look at the slogan, I think, on our literature, putting heart into healing, I think it's such an important topic. Any of you here been a patient recently? Yeah. So when you're around the other side of the operating theatre or the table, it kind of feels differently, doesn't it? And many of you will know that positive states of mind promote healing, and a lot of that is to do with how the interaction between the patient and the disease and the practitioner. And so it feels very lovely when someone's really present for you and you have that connection. It feels different, and of course it affects the body. So that whole area of mind and body health, healing and spirituality is really the area where the foundation is working. And one of the resources it's produced is Values in Healthcare, a spiritual approach, and that's essentially a training manual, a manual for health workers, basically to support their work and particularly their well-being, because we're not very good at looking after ourselves as health workers, and there's a lot of information about that, and that's really getting them to look at how they work more in a value-based way, as I was mentioning, and connecting with the whole person. And another resource which I'd like to mention, Lifting Your Spirits, and this is a resource that's just been developed for patients travelling through illness and disability, and that's to support their journey, and I'll speak a little bit about that afterward. That is a very beautiful resource. I would just like to thank the Brahma Kumaris at this point for their support to the Jankey Foundation for providing the facilities for the day and their generosity in providing the food and drinks. So in the centre is Dr. Sarah Eager. She's a consultant psychiatrist working with the elderly. She has a long-standing interest in spirituality and health and is presently the chair of the special interest group at the Royal College of Psychiatry, which is looking at spirituality and psychiatry, very interesting area. And she's also the lead on the Values in Healthcare project. And then close to me is Reverend Gillian Munro, and she's based up in beautiful Scotland, and she's head of spiritual care at NHS Tayside. And I know she's going to speak about that during the session, but they've really been doing some quite pioneering work in Scotland, and usually Scotland's quite ahead of the game in terms of those kind of issues. And on our far side is Ian Govia, who has a background in nursing, a very experienced nurse, and is presently the development manager for the nursing leadership at the National Leadership and Innovation Agency for Healthcare in Wales. So it's very appropriate that he's sitting close to the harp. Ian's very experienced, and I think it would be fair to say from the conversations he has a passion for working with people, and he also does consultancy and leadership and mentoring. So I'm going to hand it over to our panel now.
Thank you, David. I was thinking that we're from England, Scotland and Wales. It sounds a bit like the start of a joke, doesn't it? There are 3 people in a boat. And we're also doctor, nurse and minister, faith minister. So it's a nice spread. So I was interested, Gillian, how did you come to be in the position of working in healthcare and spirituality? What's your journey like?
I think my journey really began when I was a teacher in Israel, and for the first time in the 70s became aware of just how rich a treasure there was across different faiths and different people. And coming home from there, I became involved in pastoral care, working for my church, and realizing that apart from all the rich tradition there of ritual, ceremony, the fundamental need people had was for someone to accompany them on their journey when things were difficult. So I worked in 2 different parishes, and from there decided that the place I really wanted to be was within the healthcare setting. I worked mainly in palliative care and in cancer care in Aberdeen in Scotland for some years, and at that point became aware that whereas spiritual care is really quite well developed in hospitals, the NHS in a limited way only was providing spiritual care for people living in the community. And I hope I have an opportunity to say more about that later, so perhaps I should pause there, but that really is fundamentally the work that I'm very much involved with in NHST side now.
You're in a chaplaincy department or spiritual care department?
We were traditionally a lot of little different chaplaincy departments across NHST side, and my responsibility going there 6 years ago on the direction of the Scottish Government, or executive as it was at that time, was to make one department and bring all of the different chaplains together really to provide spiritual care. In other words, to recognise that religion is very important, but we provide spiritual care for people, or we facilitate spiritual care for people of all faiths and none.
I like that, all faiths and none, and I might ask you about that a bit later, because it's an interesting way of describing things that's come into the kind of language now. And Ian, what was your journey? How did you end up being involved in spirituality and health?
I suppose my journey began in infancy. I was brought up in a home where faith in God was very important. It was a way of life. And I suppose as I've progressed through my life, I've had an interest in things spiritual, and faith has always been important to me. And I think I became a nurse, actually started my nurse training per se in the 1980s. And soon realised that people coming into hospital or faced with any kind of, whether it's an illness or something that sort of threatens their normal everyday life, start to ask questions about it and ask why it's happening to them, and even perhaps even question their own meaning in life. And so there was an interest there. And so these sort of things have sort of fueled my interest. And I suppose some years ago, while I was pursuing a master's degree, my dissertation was exploring spirituality in healthcare. And so, again, from that, looking at the literature and trying to come up with some definition or framework for the provision of spirituality in healthcare, my interest has continued. And again, as far as the Jankey Foundation, some years ago, I received an email from the Royal College of Nursing, for whom I was working at the time, which mentioned about a weekend for facilities of the values in healthcare. And I've been interested in that ever since. I think we'd all like to know about Sarah's journey, wouldn't we?
I never thought you'd ask. As you know, I'm a psychiatrist, and also I've been meditating for about 30 years, and I guess I always almost experienced them as being two separate bits of my life. There was, my meditation spiritual life, and then also my medical life. And it's been very interesting to see how, especially within the Royal College of Psychiatrists, those two streams have been enabled to join with the special interest group in spirituality and psychiatry, which it's an interesting story because we had someone on the council at the time when there was a suggestion that there should be a special interest group, and I think you need more than 10 people to start a special interest group in the college, or something like that, or 50 people, and they sort of said, oh well, that will never take off, will it? That's won't happen. And now we've got over 2,000 psychiatrists, which shows the level of interest. And I think just within patient groups now, and there's a lot of legislation, and there's a lot more in Scotland as well, saying that spirituality is important, and human rights and patient charter, all kinds of things are actually saying that we should be taking note of people's spirituality. But I'm finding, trying to get it into my own NHS trust and the different places I've gone to give talks, there's still something there's quite a lot of resistance. And even though you can think it's a good idea, I'm quite interested as to what is making it difficult for people to implement. And I think that would be something I'd be interested in, because even recently we had an editorial in the Royal College of Psychiatry's journal or bulletin, and it sparked off some very diverse correspondence where there was some group of doctors saying, yes, of course we must take into account patient spirituality, and another group who was saying spirituality's got nothing to do with medicine or psychiatry, so just leave it out. So I was just wondering what you thought, Ian. What do you think is the link between spirituality and health? Why should healthcare practitioners be taking notice of their patients' spirituality?
If I can perhaps prelude that response by thinking something I was thinking about this morning, that interestingly from the literature that exists about spirituality in healthcare, perhaps less so now, but certainly 10, 15 years ago, there's a notion that spirituality is somehow equated to religion. And yes, for many that's important, yet it is far more encompassing, far more wide-reaching. And I've also noticed, as many perhaps here have, that there are some often referred to as taboo subjects in society, and they often are sexuality, politics, and religion. And often I found even in healthcare that people aren't prepared and open to talk about those things. And perhaps what I've discovered, Sarah, is that when we start talking about spirituality, again, finding a language is often a challenge, a language that is common to all people. But really coming down to things about the meaning of life, as far as the meaning of an experience for a patient. And I've discovered when sort of talking to staff, and especially patients, about that, they're far more open to talk about it. So looking for meaning in things.
And I guess getting, ending up in hospital or having a serious illness, many people would say, why has this happened to me? What does it mean? I don't know, Gillian, what are your thoughts on the link?
I think the two are inevitably linked. We had a document produced as a part of the initiative of the Scottish Government last year called Religion and Belief Matters, and in the foreword it says that spiritual care is no longer an option, but essential. And I know many people, even within my own health board, would agree with that. But one thing I would want to pick up on is, although we do have a lot of legislation and we do have guidelines, we just had our guidelines revised in Scotland, we really are quite far ahead in looking at the place of spiritual care in healthcare. Legislation doesn't mean to say that it will happen. We still have resistance in certain areas. And I feel that the legislation, the guidelines, the standards, all of these things are terribly important. But until we actually help people to understand, we are still not going to get it adopted. We don't want people to begin to look at spiritual care because the government say they have to. I don't think that's a good reason for looking at spiritual care. I think we have to actually help people understand the difference that it makes. So another initiative we have started looking at, and I'm hoping to develop in our own board area, is Better Care, Scotland's Patient Experience Programme. One of the things I was being told on Friday at a meeting I attended is that by the time I put my annual report in next year, I'm not only going to have to say what my department does, I'm actually going to have to say how I have measured the difference it makes. Now, in spiritual care, that's a challenge. But it's the challenge I think we actually have to be ready to face, because unless we face that challenge of actually explaining to people the difference that spiritual care makes, we're not going to encourage those who are either on the margin or haven't even reached the margin yet. We're not going to help them understand. I think when you work day by day with patients in a healthcare setting, listening to them, letting them themselves explore the kind of questions you're posing, Ian, because I don't think any of us try to give them the answers. We try to help them explore these differences. We actually watch the difference it makes. And there is some evidence now which shows it does actually physically make a difference. But as I'm the minister, not the doctor or the nurse, I don't think I should talk about the physical evidence that is there to help people. I don't know if you found that in your work, Sarah.
Well, I think there is a lot of studies now that have shown that people with an underlying faith or strong belief system that supports them, that it does have positive outcomes in their physical health as well. But I was curious about when you said you're going to have to show how the spiritual care department is improving patient outcomes. Mm-hmm. How would you go about that?
Because it's only asked on Friday. I think it is exciting. I've looked at different systems, and I don't know if you would agree with this, Ian, or not, but I think one of the problems we have is that when we say that we want to measure someone's spirituality at the moment, what people often take from that is we're going to ask if they have a faith or belief or not. And we don't often move beyond that. And it's because it's difficult. It's going to have to be about qualitative research, because quantitative research doesn't fit in here. And it's one of the reasons for me hoping that I can develop patient stories is because I think it's the most telling way. If you can visit with people following their experience of having come through their journey in hospital, and we talk a lot about journeying with people in our department, as happens in many areas of healthcare. If we can talk to people about their patient experience and hear what has been good, what has actually made a difference to them, but also be ready to face the challenge of talking to people about their patient experience and what has been bad for them. And we gather these stories and we begin to analyse what has made the journey good for that person, which may very well be that the nurse spent 5 minutes one morning listening to them or explaining to them what was actually happening so that they felt recognised as a whole person. Because it's about being a whole person, being respected as a whole person. If we can gather patient stories for the good and the bad, I'm hoping that will be the start of saying, this is the difference our department is making. But I have to say, it's not only my department in NHS Tayside that provides spiritual care. We support nursing staff, doctors, domestics, all the rest of the staff in providing spiritual care.
Maybe we could pick that up later, because I think that is a very valid point. But patient stories, Ian, is that something you've come across as a way of capturing information.
And I think, listen to what you were saying there, Gillian, and again, looking around the audience here this morning, and many of whom will work in healthcare, will be familiar with, I suppose, government targets, performance indicators, all these things. I can see you all nodding. Yes. And these have their place, of course. And interesting, I met with a chaplain a couple of weeks ago, and he was asked by his general manager, who is now managing him, about his return on the trust's investment. And this is the language. This is the language of trust boards and things like that. And perhaps for those of us who are trying to champion spirituality, perhaps we need to harness some of that language ourselves, and then start talking in those terms. And patient stories perhaps are another useful way of then capturing the patient experience. It's so much hard data out there, isn't it? And I've also learned that the hard skills are the soft skills, and the soft skills are the hard skills. And spirituality, I think, is a hard, soft skill. And asking patients and their families and their carers about their experience of healthcare is not just a valuable, I think it's an essential aspect of how we do that. And of course, the key thing I believe as well is that patient stories. How many of us are familiar with satisfaction questionnaires? We've probably all asked them and filled them in. I can see you smiling there. And yet they ask the patients what we want to know. Whereas patient stories is the patient's experience. And the dialogue often starts with, tell me more, or tell me about when you first came to the ward. Tell me about. It's not my agenda, it's the patient's agenda. And what I've discovered in undertaking many over the last 7 or 8 years is that patients then begin to talk about the things that we would equate as being spiritual.
And you're talking about asking patients or relatives what their spiritual needs are. I mean, I've been asked to introduce that into my own trust, and it's been a very interesting process of just trying to find a format that actually the trust feels they can take up. And it's quite complicated because apparently when a patient is admitted to hospital, at the moment there's 30 forms that the nurses have to fill out. And so when we said, well, can you do another form on spiritual care, they sort of said, please, no more forms. But on the other hand, we find if there isn't something which guides people as to how to elicit that information and see what their concerns are from people, then the questions, apart from, as you say, what religion are you, the questions never get asked. And so the whole process, and I've been trying to involve a group, is to decide, well, what questions can be asked. So I'd be interested to know what your experience has been on that, because in a way, unless you know how to assess or identify patients' spiritual needs, they won't get explored. So I don't know which of you want to.
I think you've hit on one of the main focuses there has to be if we're going to develop spiritual care effectively in the NHS, and that is actually training and education. Because it doesn't actually matter how many questions you ask, unless the person asking the question has a real understanding of A, the importance of asking these questions, B, how to ask the questions, and actually I think have an understanding of their own spirituality, you're going to struggle to get the information that you require. So I think training and education are a main focus there. I would personally say the system we have just doesn't work, and we're looking at 3 ways of looking at it. And one which I think is very important, we've got a pilot scheme on, is helping patients take ownership of their own spirituality to a certain measure. Because when you go into hospital, you lose control of most things. Even when you get a cup of tea, you lose control of so much, and you feel out of control. And I think if we can help people in some way take responsibility for saying to staff, I have spiritual needs and I want them met, I think that's important. And the simple way we're doing that is working with some local faith communities and having leaflets that encourage people to say that they're going into hospital. And at least that's a start. Their faith community leaders will know they're going into hospital. We had a slightly different system from you. We didn't have 30 pages. We had 30-odd questions, and spiritual care was number 24. So we found that by the time nurses got to question number 24, they'd run out of time and our questions weren't asked. So we're developing flowcharts to help nurses or whoever is doing the admission at that point to say to people, not only do you have a faith community you would like us to link into, but so we have chaplains and this is what they can do to help you. And here's a leaflet that will tell you, do you think you would like one of them to listen to you? So we'll have this follow through the whole time there. And we're also looking at an electronic system, but that can only ever be as good as the information put into it.
Yeah, that's true. Mm-hmm. Ian, you've had quite an involvement in assessment. What are your thoughts on and the barriers and the difficulties in getting it off the ground?
I suppose many of us will be familiar with the sort of the perfunctory form filling that occurs in healthcare settings. And I have been part of that, and dare I say, I've even contributed to it in various roles within nursing and healthcare. And some years ago, as I was exploring the literature in quite a deep manner surrounding spirituality in healthcare, I made a clumsy attempt to try and come up with some guidelines for assessment. And perhaps more than anything, perhaps what it's doing, Sarah, is just starting a conversation. And many of us will know, and if we're in tune with the people that we care for, we will know when it's not appropriate to pursue those things. And for some people, some of those things may appear meaningless. They may even appear irrelevant in certain situations. I think the important thing is that we instigate the conversation and then allow the patient to respond to that. And perhaps I could also say a feeling around that, but when we talk about spirituality in healthcare, I also believe that spirituality and providing it is not necessarily a list of orders and tasks that we do. And that in some respects, and perhaps from a personal experience, is that spirituality was not necessarily what I did, but what I brought to the relationship. It was who I was, and how my spirit, if I could use that term, interacted with that other person's spirit as well. What about you? Because I know you're interested in this line as well, so share with us what your thoughts are.
Well, I think what I've experienced in trying, in a sense, if there isn't some kind of form that it doesn't bring it to people's attention, and you need the training as well. So trying to develop workshops where staff practice asking these questions of each other. But I think it does also link into that issue of, does spirituality belong to everyone? Because people are used to asking the question, what religion are you? But if, so I was trying to come up with a question that's much more open, and often what I will say is what supports you when times are difficult, what lifts your spirits, those kind of things, to get an idea of what's important to them in their life, and what gives you hope, what gives you meaning, what gives you comfort, who do you love, or that kind of thing. And then you can say, does the spirituality or faith play a part in that? But when we say, do atheists have a spirituality? Do agnostics or people of no faith? How do you access those people's spirituality? Because I think it's very easy for nurses to say, this person's a Catholic, we'll call the priest, the minister. But the difficulty in having a much more open conversation with everyone, because I sense that we three feel that spirituality is something that belongs to everyone, but how do you have that conversation? What's your experience?
And I think that goes back to, we have to understand what spirituality is, and we have to be comfortable with our own spirituality. I think part of the problem is terminology and language, in that if I think of the Christian church, which I'm part of, spirit in it means something very specific, and it's a Christian term. To me, it's much further beyond that, because spirit is ruach, which is your spirit that allows you to breathe. and it's your spirit that makes you alive. So I don't see it in terms of one particular faith or in terms of faith, but I think that is something people struggle with. I've had very interesting conversations with some humanists who are on our advisory committee within our board area, and I also have some who are volunteer visitors for our department. And they are quite clear that, and very involved at national level of discussions about spirituality, because they recognize that they have spiritual needs. They ask the same questions about meaning. They may come to different answers. They may start in their questioning from a different point, but they need help just as much as someone who either recognizes their faith or has a dormant faith that they're not recognizing. And the way to help people talk about these issues is to talk about how special or how difficult life is to them at any particular time. And yes, we would follow exactly the pattern you're suggesting, Sarah, after that. Then, having asked what is special or what's difficult in life, ask them what their support system is, and it may be their family the answer, or we may begin to speak about another being, about a faith, about something. But I would pick up something you said earlier, Ian, which I think is so important. We're then allowing these people to explore what it is in their life that's important. So to me, what the spiritual aspects of their life are.
Certainly when I was looking at this whole area, there was someone working in a palliative care unit, Gillian White, I think, or Gillian White, and she wrote a book, and her conclusion was that a narrative approach was really the best way, which links into the idea of patient stories, although I'm curious to know how patient stories become data or evidence. If you could tell us a bit about that might be helpful. But in that book, she was saying that really, if the nurses had a kind of some prompts and a schematic, but they could keep returning to the conversations over time. And of course, as a patient, your experience is changing as well, isn't it? So the nurses, it's not just a one-off thing, and we see that with patients. Sometimes they're very angry with God or angry with their faith that it's not helped, but you can then follow that journey and it changes, so it's not static either.
If I can pick up on one of the things, how we perhaps raise the awareness of spirituality. And again, we talk about and often pay lip service to the term holism in healthcare, and it's used in certainly preparing nurses preparing student nurses to become registered nurses for their careers. I'm sure it happens in other healthcare preparation areas as well, and yet often we pay lip service to it. And of course the challenge, as we mentioned earlier, is that we work in an environment, in a healthcare culture that is very much about the now. It's short-termism and short-term goals, and we recognize that spirituality and relationships are often long-term things, and they're exploring perhaps more of a long-term, even an eternal realm in nature. And what I've discovered, and something that really lifted my spirits, if I can use that term, I met with the director of nursing of a foundation trust in north of Manchester some months ago. And although we didn't speak about spirituality in healthcare, she spoke about that since she was appointed to the director of nursing post and placed on the trust board, she noticed the lack of attention to clinical matters on the trust agenda. And the first thing she resolved to do was that the first agenda item for every trust meeting was a patient story. So it reminded the trust board, the finance director, the HR director, the non-execs, the chief exec and the chair, what they were there for. What is our core business as a hospital or a community PCT or whatever it would be. So they put patient stories at the core of what they do. And what I'm noticing is that invariably when patients themselves come to these meetings, they start talking about things that we would deem spiritual. So I'm wondering if that may be a platform, if we can have other people who champion those things, where patients come and talk and have a dialogue about that experience, then it may raise the awareness and the importance of it.
I mean, the whole holism issue does raise an even more fundamental question, isn't it, of what is your understanding of what is a human being. And this is something I find, is that if you're talking to a group of doctors or people who just see that you're a bunch of chemicals that's reacting in a certain way, well then they're less inclined to see the significance of this. But I think if people at least accept that you're body, mind and spirit, then you've got some basis for saying, well, these things are always interacting with each other, and therefore how the spirit is obviously going to have some impact on the body and vice versa. So, but as you say, the holism has become part of the jargon, and it's almost lip service, because on the ground you're not necessarily seeing that people are able to implement that in a real sense of being present with people. And I think David mentioned that. And I was wondering, when you said it's what you bring to the encounter, to the connection, to the relationship, that's really most important. And you talked about also supporting staff. So for people who aren't necessarily chaplains or trained spiritual care deliverers, how do you think their spirituality impacts, or how can you help develop that or enable them to be their spiritual selves as the caregivers as well as those receiving?
Yeah. And it raises a number of issues. And I'm aware, I'm actually referring to a paper that I think you wrote, Ian, which I thought was so telling, in the fact that if we have people with their own strong faith, what do they bring to their nursing career? And it, on the whole, is that they bring something very special, but we then have to watch how their own beliefs impact on their patients, which I think is terribly important. But I think what we have a responsibility, I should perhaps put it this way: as a department of spiritual care, our primary function is to provide care for patients, carers and staff. But I would expect us to be spending all our time in one-to-one relationships with people doing that. A lot of our time is actually in training and in running workshops with staff, for the very reason you were saying. And I will have staff regularly come along to workshops to understand better what spiritual care is. But as part of that, we would always look at their own spirituality. Because I believe that people actually have to feel comfortable with themselves as spiritual beings before they really can facilitate the growth of others or help other people on their journey through healthcare in that spiritual way. So I expect the first step in that is we have to help people understand that they are spiritual beings who can give this added dimension in their care as they are caring for people. And that has to be, again, through education, training and workshops.
How would you do that? In your workshops, how do you do that?
Well, for example, one little exercise, which is very simple, very straightforward, we do, is I will ask people to write down 6 things that are most important to them in their lives. And they're not going to have to share this with anyone else, so they can write down the things that really do matter to them and are as difficult as possible. And then I'll ask them to look at those 6 things and take one away. And I have had people at that point say to me, Gillian, I can't do this exercise, it's too difficult. And we then go on and say, can you take away another 2, so that people end up with one thing, and very few people ever get to being left with only one choice. And we then explore within that how they felt, because we're not asking them what they wrote, but we are asking them how they feel and to share with the others and how they felt doing the whole exercise. And we will then take that into how the patients feel, who don't actually have the choice of what is going to be taken away from them, but these things are automatically being taken away from them. And from a simple exercise like that, we can begin to talk about spirituality and how people feel as spiritual beings.
Any ideas how you would
Yes,
tackle that?
a story came to mind as Gillian was talking and for me to share this. And you mentioned about how you're feeling, and how many of us say, how are you? And we rarely wait for a response. And perhaps that's the difference in a healthcare relationship. And I put my hand up, and I've probably been guilty of it, as many of us here may be. And perhaps it's taking the time to say to someone who is going through an experience, an illness experience, and the impact that it has on their life and their family and their friends. And it's saying, how are you feeling? And waiting for a response rather than just moving on. It's actually engaging and taking time. And I will hear nurses saying, but I don't have time. And I recognize that comment, those feelings. Dare I say it? And please come and argue with me after if you disagree. But we have to make time, and we have to decide what our priorities are in providing healthcare. And to use a story, some years ago, whilst working, I was a ward sister on a burns unit. And I remember we had a gentleman in who'd been, hadn't had a major burn in terms of size, but in terms of the impact on him, it was huge. And he had burns to his face and to his hands. His hands were up in slings. He couldn't, he'd lost that degree of independence. And I read his story yesterday when I was travelling up here on the train. I'd forgotten about it in many ways. And perhaps it illustrates some of the things that we've been talking about this morning. Because for about 2 or 3 days, this gentleman would not cooperate with us. And he would not do anything. He would not eat. And all the sort of normal everyday activities of living, he would not cooperate with the team. And I remember going to his bedside one morning. I called his name John. John, please share with me how you're feeling at the moment. And then there was a silence that was deafening. And he started to cry, excuse me, because and he started to shed some tears. And it was as if time stopped for a moment. I'm not sure how long I spent there, but I listened to him. And when he left hospital, he wrote a letter to the chief executive that I was privileged to have a copy of. And very briefly, he shared, up until that point, he had considered himself a self-made man. He had always relied upon himself. He'd been very independent. And I think what I've recognized as far as spirituality and healthcare and relationships, it's an interdependency. We need each other. And once he realized that there was perhaps the conversation that we had over a matter of weeks then, he realized there was something more to him than this self-made independent being. And that he needed perhaps to develop some humility and to start exploring some of the very questions that he'd been asking himself. But it took that time to have that dialogue and perhaps somebody to stop and ask, how are you feeling? And take time to listen.
I think it is interesting how when we do take the time to really connect with someone, and I think that's a really important thing that you've raised about the time, because I know I am often under an enormous pressure. But if I don't actually make the effort to stop and listen and connect, I in fact end up needing more time to deal with that person, because it's almost like until they feel they have your attention and in some ways your care, your compassion, they're not going to leave you alone almost, or let you move on, or they'll come back for another appointment, or things will just escalate. And so by giving time, you save time in the end. But it's to have that discipline of really making yourself, as you say, sit and be with someone and really allow yourself to connect with them and hear what's going on and hear their story. And unfortunately, I find that the systems around us at the moment are getting more complicated, and so many, as you say, if the clinical content of the board meetings is only 11%, that you're getting swept up in a whole lot of other concerns to run the system, that can be the thing that gets eroded. It's just that time, that connection, that relationship with your patients, and how much you need to really make that a priority, and to remind yourself that is your priority. And to me, that has become almost a spiritual discipline, because it does mean to be able to stop and be still. And I think those kind of skills would be helpful to teach people. And I think that's obviously what we had in mind with the Values in Healthcare project, that we felt we could see that people perhaps wanted to deliver compassionate care, but didn't know how to, and certainly weren't supported because of all these. I mean, I can understand if there are infections in a hospital, people need to know how to wash their hands properly. So there are many, many other standards, but it's like people are being pulled in so many directions. It's hard to know what is the important thing. I don't know what your thoughts are.
And it can be difficult for a nurse who recognises the need of that patient to sit down for 5 minutes by the bedside and really listen when she sees all her colleagues busy looking after everyone else. And I think what we actually have to do is give people permission to listen. I couldn't agree more that if you actually listen completely, I love the Chinese character for, is it ear or to listen, because it involves the heart and the whole person as well as all the other aspects of listening. And I think if you really focus, and we talk about patient-focused care, if we really focus on a patient for 5 minutes, we can actually save another appointment for someone else who also needs that real listening. But until we give nurses permission, or any healthcare worker, to really listen, then we don't allow them to fulfill their own spiritual caring of that patient. And we have a responsibility to staff as well as to patients in allowing them to feel that their vocation as a nurse, a domestic, a doctor, whatever, is fulfilled in caring for people.
Sometimes I feel you have to be a bit of a rebel to say that now. I don't know. Do you think it's difficult to get that time? Talk about protected patient engagement time.
Yes.
But
I guess so.
Is it happening?
Is it happening? I suppose yes and no. And in fact, some of you may be familiar with some initiatives that are very sort of government-led, releasing time to care. In Wales, Free to Lead, Free to Care. And these are initiatives which are perhaps looking at what we do in healthcare environments, specifically perhaps I'm talking about hospital environments, and what of those things can be delegated or to others, which allows healthcare staff and nurses especially to focus on caring. And again, it's early days with some of the initiatives in Wales, but what I am noticing that nurses are feeling a little more time and having time to care. And I suppose, coming back to something I said earlier, that providing spirituality healthcare is not a list of orders on a care plan. It may incorporate that, but certainly it's raising healthcare staff's awareness of what spirituality is and taking it to the relationship and being open and sharing and especially listening, whatever that patient describes, and that may have nothing to do with religious views. Something I think that we're familiar with, I read some years ago, is this notion, and forgive me, it's a theory, of horizontal and vertical spirituality. And the writer Carson shared this notion that many people have a vertical type of spirituality, and that is a relationship perhaps with a deity, God, whatever you would want to call that person. And there are those people then perhaps on the other side that have a horizontal dimension or relationship, and she describes that as relationships with the environment. It could be music, art, those sorts of things. And for some people, the vertical spirituality is not relevant, and yet they still have spiritual needs that are expressed and experienced through creative acts, through the environment. And so come back to a question you asked earlier about the needs of those individuals. I think we need to facilitate those needs. And it also then reminds me of, again, about as healthcare workers, not only do we have to create our own personal environment, we need to create a healthcare environment that promotes spirituality. And a question I think I asked you yesterday evening, Gillian, was have you noticed that sometimes when you go into different environments, some are more conducive to relationships and spiritual care than others? And if that is the case, what do you think is the difference that makes the difference?
Well, coming from a background of palliative care, working in the hospice in Aberdeen and having a splendid hospice in Dundee, I think we very much see the difference that the environment can make, because our two hospices are very different, or the two hospices in these two cities are very different. But apart from nurse-patient ratio and all the other differences there are as well, there's just, this may sound strange, but I had the same feeling walking into one of my hospices, walking into Sanctuary in Dundee, as I had walking in here last night. That there's that feeling of caring for the whole person, of the spirit, mind, and body, and I think that's so special. And so long as we go into busy, hectic wards, which are being provided as well as they can, but we haven't actually looked at trying to do something to make the whole environment a little better. And it can often be the simplest things, not major things. If we don't make those a little better, I think we do actually see the difference. We held a conference which some folk from here, or who I've met over this weekend, were present at in September on bereavement in NHS Tayside, and we had visitors from Ireland who spoke to us about a project they are looking at that's not only in hospices, it's actually the environment of all healthcare settings, and the work they had done was very interesting. And they are showing that the environment you are in does make a difference, but environment can also be created by staff. So if you have a very good charge nurse looking after a ward, she or he can actually change that environment just because of the care they provide, not only for their patients and their visitors, but also the relationship they have with all the staff working in that ward.
5 minutes, okay. Mm-hmm. You mentioned earlier about spiritual care not just in hospitals, and we have been quite focused in that, but also in the community. Did you want to say anything about that?
Thank you, Sarah. Mm-hmm. It's a passion of mine, and it came from working in the hospice up in Aberdeen when I worked there. I also always felt a great reward from working with my patients and the family and the staff in the inpatient unit. But watching people in the hospital going home, in the inpatient unit at times going home, but most of all, working with patients who came into daycare unit, I became very aware that a lot of the spiritual needs, while in the hospital setting, day or inpatient, these needs were met by nurses, by doctors, by all the other staff round about, and by the other patients. And I think other patients have a great place of inputting into spiritual care of people. But a lot of their problems arose when they went home into the community. And if we're looking at things like the Liverpool Care Pathway, really making sure processes are in place for people to die at home if that's where they wish to die, if we are looking at supporting people more and more in the community with long-term conditions, with mental health care problems, at the same time as being aware in society that fewer people are attending church, other faith communities, I think one of the major problems for people or for the NHS over the next decades are going to be isolation and loneliness, a lot of it coming from bereavement. And so I think it's terribly important. We actually are going to have a conference on this in a few weeks' time, asking people, what do we do to support people spiritually in the community if they don't have their own natural local community to provide that? And that's a challenge.
Yeah, that's a challenge. I'm aware we're going to have to wind up, but I was also just had one question in mind. Was I know sometimes we're thinking about what are the barriers to making space for spirituality, and the whole issue of if we ask these questions of our patients, can we deal with the answers? You know, and that I think is sometimes what is difficult for people. And especially if you're caring for the dying, have you thought about your own death? What does it mean to die? And even to ask your patients, what do you think is going to happen to you when you die? Things like that. And so how do we have forums or places where those kind of existential stroke spiritual questions can be discussed? So as you say, the staff themselves feel if someone... I often find I get landed with the most difficult patients because people say, she can handle it. But I'm aware that other people, they're just flawed really, and so it's difficult to have that exploration. And we're talking about matters of life and death and very deep issues for people. So any final thoughts before we finish?
May I share a story? And thank you for that question. And thank you for sharing those thoughts, because that'll inform hopefully what I say, Gillian. One thing I've always felt as a healthcare professional, as a nurse, is that it's very important for me to know where my expertise begins. I think it's even more important for me to know where it ends. And that's not just when I was working clinically or even what I do now. That often equates in terms of how I manage relationships. And if there are some things that I think are outside of my sphere of competence, I need to recognize that and then find someone who can pick up those pieces. And that may be through a chaplaincy service, it may be through a counselling service, whatever that may be. And I hope I've recognised that, and also hope that I've encouraged other members of teams to recognise that. And here's the story, and this is perhaps me sharing a little bit of my journey I didn't divulge earlier. About 11 years ago, I was on the wrong end of a hit-and-run accident, and the details are not important. But of course, what that did was actually put me into a patient experience. And I was actually being cared for by people who I had taught as a tutor in nursing, who I had worked alongside. Yeah? They knew me, and knew me very intimately now, because I was in an intensive care environment. And sufficient to say that I survived what was a very serious accident. And it taught me a lot about myself. And when I went back to work in a ward environment, on a burns ward, I remember one Monday morning, and again this perhaps says something about the faith that many of us share today. I remember a patient who just didn't seem to open up, who was very withdrawn. And I remember meditating just quietly, and I saying a prayer to myself in the changing room in the morning. And it was something like, please help me to find some way to reach this man today. And it was about, again, hoping for some space or something. And as I walked past this gentleman, who'd been horribly burnt and injured, he looked at me with the anger in his face. And there was almost venom in it. And the language was very colourful. And he said, you don't know what I'm going through. You have no idea what I'm going through. And I stopped for a moment. I said, yes, you're right. I don't know what you are going through. However, I have gone through an experience, and I recognize some of the things that you are going through at the moment. And I'd like to sit down and just listen to you. And you know how these things happen. We sometimes can't explain them. Sometimes we call them coincidences. I like to call them God incidences. Do you know, for an hour, I was not interrupted. Ward sister on a Monday morning, busy, I was not interrupted. And I spent an hour behind those curtains and listened to this gentleman. And it was just the beginning of part of the spiritual healing process for that gentleman. So thank you for letting me share that.
Well, I think that is a very timely pause for us for our next speaker, who I'm sure would like to take up that theme of how you call on God's help in your healing roles. But thank you both very much for having this conversation, and I hope you've all found it interesting to listen to. So I think David's coming back up, or no, Diego is going to play us another song. So I think we go down now, and thank you all very much.